Okay, so I'm trying to think about how to start this. Okay, one of my favorite documentaries is Room 237 by Rodney Asher. It's about presenting several interpretations of the film The Shining that are objectively incorrect and not supported by the text at all, but are fascinating just because you get to see a window into how people, us humans with our pattern recognition skills, see what happens when somebody gets really devoted to a piece of fiction to a point where basically reality no longer matters, and instead it's just all about like people just synthesizing things from nothing. It's a really interesting study. I just always like seeing that. I like hearing about people's, I always think that's just such an interesting slice of the human condition. And, like a lot of nerds, I'm really into Dark Souls. And, theory crafting is a big part of that. And for the most part, I'm not really involved with that. But recently, somebody has published a theory of an overarching theory about Dark Souls that the best summary I can give is that Dark Souls is actually about how in the 90s, this creator, this person, they post as Sibyl Disobedience on the Something Awful forums. Their theory is that Dark Souls is actually about a trans woman who is responsible for creating Final Fantasy and several other high-profile RPGs that came from Square in the 90s, and she has since been erased from history because of her gender identity, and that the Dark Souls series is all about putting clues in there about, it's all about putting these clues in there to lead people to do it. I'm not making fun of this person. I did mull over for a while. It's like, I'm not making fun of a trans person for looking for gender in a work of fiction. Dark Souls is great, and there's a lot of really interesting takes on gender and stuff in it that people have done. I'm not against that. It's just this particular one goes so far and has so many leaps of logic that it is just fascinating to go through. So I'm just going to read the whole thing to you, start to finish, Sibyl Disobedience's posts, and I'm just going to put them on the screen here because there's nothing I could add to this. This person's theory is they've done all the heavy lifting. So without further ado, here is Sibyl Disobedience's Undeath of the Author, our theory. Okay. So she opens with the quote from, there's no point trying to work out unsolvable problems. To be, near automata. Doors that shouldn't be open are awfully tempting, aren't they? Margareta Derricine. Undeath of the Author, Velka. Dark Souls is a tomb. In the tradition of Don Quixote, stated inspiration for the character Lucatiel of Mira, the entire Souls series is a grand literary experience in metafiction. And when you put the pieces together, any metafiction interpretation revolves around the repeating theme of a world built from the corpse of a dying god, with the most central variant of the myth revolving around the series' anonymous and now very dead creator, Seath. That is to say that the entire Soulsborne series is a memorial for an actually existing, nameless person. Old Pale Drake Souls from Dark Souls 2. Soul of the Ineffable, the once magnificent soul continues to exert influence over the land, even after the eons have reduced it to these remnants. But I wasn't content leaving things at that. I wanted to attempt soul reconstruction surgery, so I endeavored in the most sacred of rituals in all of gaming, clipping out of bounds. Look, I was instructed to link the flame, but no one precisely defined the boundaries. That one's on you, FromSoft. Blame yourself, or God. Through the application of symbolic resonance, I think I've triangulated the trajectory of Seath's travels through 3 decades of influence in the video game industry, and the tale is rapturous. It's a story both terrible and beautiful in equal measure, and it demands to be seen, blasphemy or not. Like I said last time, you can learn a lot about a pharaoh by the objects they choose to be buried with, and following this has taken me somewhere I never thought I'd be going back to, the Final Fantasy series. Treasure hunting. It took me an embarrassingly long time to notice, but referential structures to the Final Fantasy games are everywhere in Soulsborne. The first one that caught my eye was how the rat fight on the scaffolding at the top of Bloodborne's research hall was reminiscent of Final Fantasy VI's Opera House scene, complete with a Maria of sorts below them. I chalk this up to fun nostalgia, probably just a fan or two on the dev team. But earlier in the Hunter's Nightmare, we find Lawrence, the first Vicar, resting in a pose inspired by the famous sculpture, the Pieta. Final Fantasy VI references the same motif in its final boss battle. The third phase features 2 figures engaged in the same pose, and Maria is the Japanese name for the female of the pair. To take Bloodborne's DLC to even weirder places, the inexplicable giant sunflowers in the Living Failures boss arena might be a reference to Radical Dreamers, Squaresoft's 1996 text-adventure sequel to Chrono Trigger, which is honestly the weirdest, most obscure connection, and I probably wouldn't bring it up if it weren't so bizarre and unique. These cross-series motifs extend outside of Bloodborne, of course. In Dark Souls 2, you can collect rat tails for the Rat King Covenant. This is a reference to the repeating rat tail item in the Final Fantasy series. In the first game, you give one to Bahamut to upgrade your job classes. In Final Fantasy IV, the rat tail that eventually allows you to get a dwarven smith to forge Excalibur. This connection to dwarves offers an explanation as to why the Gurm are in Dark Souls 2, and why they appear to have an allegiance with the Rat King Covenant. There's also the Dark Souls 3 cover art. That's a fun one. It's running off the same sand slipping through figures motif as the Cloud Sea Djinn art featured in the splash screen of the PSP Final Fantasy I remake. And then there's the names. Beast Claw Joseph is a summoner helper we find in Bloodborne Chalice dungeons. Who is he in the context of Bloodborne? Couldn't tell you, but in terms of Final Fantasy, he is a reference to Joseph from Final Fantasy II, especially given the claws used by both characters. Dark Souls 1 has Undead Prince Ricard, which is the name of yet another Final Fantasy II character, Ricard Highwind, and yes, also the main character of FromSoft's Echo Knight, but if I'm correct, this is a reference game that has been going on for a very long time. And then there's Final Fantasy II's Maria. Obviously, we have the already mentioned inhabitant of Bloodborne's Astral Clock Tower, but the more interesting reference is in Deracina. There we have the character Marie paired with Rosa, giving us slight linguistic mutations of both the lead female characters of both Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy IV. But Deracina wasn't the first FromSoft game this pairing shows up. We see it in Dark Souls 3's Rosaria, Mother of Rebirth. We also find this naming pattern in Rosmarinus, Weapon of Bloodborne. And on the topic of Rosmarinus, one of the most memorable places we encounter in Bloodborne is the fight against Edgar, Choir Intelligencer, who wields it against us in Nightmare of Mensis. If we treat this as a Final Fantasy reference, this becomes Edgar Roni Figaro of Final Fantasy VI, wielding his iconic Bioblaster. And, not gonna lie, I marked out a bit at this one. Then there's Majorald of Lanifear at Iron Keep of Dark Souls 2, a weirdly disconnected character from most of the lore, but his armor pretty strongly resembles Lot Cole's merchant garb in Final Fantasy VI. And maybe you consider that a bit of a stretch visually, but Majorald's dialogue contains a big tell. I'm mainly a treasure hunter, you see. I'm only a merchant on the side. Hey, call me a treasure hunter or I'll rip your lungs out. Just prior to meeting Majorald, during the fight against Mytha, the Baneful Queen, we could summon Jester Thomas to assist in the fight, who, given that his armor can be bought from Majorald, is almost certainly a Kefka reference. I can keep going. In Darkroot Forest, we encounter gender-bending Ferris, likely a play off Final Fantasy V's Ferris, a female pirate captain who disguised herself as a man. A similar motif of a female soldier disguising herself as male shows up in Dark Souls 2's Lucatiel. But looking for possible naming games takes us to Chrono Trigger and the character Luca Ashtier. Drop the Ash and apply the infamous LR switch, and we have Lucatiel. You're sure to be in a fine haze right now, but don't think too hard about all this. Individually, none of these examples are proof that Dark Souls and Final Fantasy are connected, but collectively, they establish probable cause for further investigation. The creator. When we find references to other pieces of fiction inside a work, we initially assume that this simply reflects an author paying tribute to their inspirations. However, if we're willing to consider Dark Souls as a memorial to a deceased game designer, then it's a logical jump to the possibility that these games also include a tribute to this person's contributions. So if our goal is to link some flames, the obvious thing to look for is narrative parallels showing up within the Final Fantasy series in roughly the same time frame as Demon Souls. Specifically, we want to look to find things that look like memorials, but we're also looking for evidence of genderqueer elements. As I mentioned, Dark Souls is full of trans themes, and they're showing up in multiple memorials within the same time frame. Well, that's a narrative convergence that's extremely unlikely to be coincidental. So in 2008, approximately the same time that Seath's hypothetical death was proving to be a terrible inconvenience for the development of the Souls series, Squaresoft released Final Fantasy IV, The After Years. It was a pretty perplexing choice of game development, being a mobile-only episodic sequel to a 17-year-old game, but its existence makes so much more sense to me now. In the After Years, the final boss is known as the Creator, an all-powerful being on life support who is responsible for the entire game world. You are all a part of the process, the output of the evolutionary plan conceived by the crystals I created. In other words, this is all my work. The crystals, the Maenads, and this new moon. This is why I am called the Creator. And if we're expecting metatextual elements, it's especially useful that the Creator metastasis as an ability, which is the development of secondary malignant growths at a distance from a primary site of cancer, as cancer is one of those underlying themes in Bloodborne. Surgical long gloves. When a cancer is discovered, one must pinpoint its location, reach in, and wrench it from the host's bosom. Black Church Set. Most healing church hunters are elementary doctors who understand the importance of early prevention of the scourge. The creator is revered within the game as a master of the true moon, with the original Final Fantasy IV's moon described as having nothing on the creators, potentially relevant given the association of Gwyndolin with the Dark Moon Covenant, as well as Bloodborne concluding with the fight against the moon presence. So we have something here that could be functioning as a memorial to someone who would have to be rather revered to be referred to as the creator. But the thing that stood out to me were the boss graphics, because this shit is a transition timeline, a series of pictures designed to showcase the progress of a gender transition. Oh, yeah. Like, if this was a shit post about, like, you know, like when the Estradiol hits or whatever, this would be very funny, but unironically I'm sorry, this final boss, you know what, actually, I shouldn't laugh at this. The idea that JRPG final bosses having a million different phases is a trans allegory fucking rules. I love this. I'm sorry. The effect is even more stark in the iOS version. Sorry, I love this face so much. They literally gave the boss a chest covering in its final form to conceal the now female-presenting nipples. Something noteworthy is up here. Secret betrayal. Things really started to come together once I added Nier Automata to the mix. Midway through the game, we receive a side quest to venture into a dark canyon and put down the Lord of the Valley. And then, when we finally encounter the Lord, things get weird. Yes, weird even for Nier. Such pain. Kill me. Please, kill me. After fulfilling this request and turning in the quest, we leave the area only to proc a conversation between the two main characters about the nature of death. Souls in heaven, huh? Do either of those things exist? They'll find out in the end, and so will we. Okay, that's grim. At this point, a sad music track starts playing as the player climbs out of the canyon, giving this entire exchange far too much poignancy for a simple side quest. I felt the first time I encountered this that something of significance was occurring here, and I think I now know what that is. At the top of this climb is a cave that houses one of Emil's precious memories, and also a plain treasure chest. Once you find a way to connect the symbols, everything falls into place. In the back corner, we have the Lunar Tear, a flower strongly associated with the intersex character Cain from 2010's Nier Replicant. But it's the Dragoon Lance in the chest that really takes things to an interesting place, because if we're willing to entertain the possibility that Nier is capable of talking about Final Fantasy, then the Dragoon Lance points us right back to Final Fantasy IV and the character Cain. So my belief at this point is that Cain's actual secret, is that she is an authorial self-insert for the creator of Final Fantasy and Dark Souls. One of many self-inserts, as it turns out. That whole self-insert thing might seem weird to you, but it's actually far and away the easiest thing to explain about this whole mess. Anyway, Cain. Yet another self-insert, which explains why the Cain event in the phone game Final Fantasy Record Keeper was titled Pride Wakens. As for the Dark Souls and Seath, well, if we're looking within Final Fantasy for the identity of an individual who betrayed their own, Cain is the obvious choice. But surely it's absurd that Final Fantasy could have been created by a trans woman or an adjacent non-binary / intersex identity. There were no signs. You heard it here, folks. The fact that Final Fantasy VII had a relatively problematic gay panic scene that was greatly improved upon in a remake 25 years later means that a trans person made Final Fantasy. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be riffing on this. We're just here for the good stuff, but human beings are awesome. I love our brains. We are such cool creatures. Sentiments like this aren't a new addition. They've been there for decades. Male, female, what's the difference? Power is beautiful, and I've got the power. It's just that the more recent titles can get away with being a bit more overt about it. Now that I'm actually looking back, trans themes are all over the Final Fantasy series. Some of them overt, like Flea's dialogue and Chrono Trigger. Many of them much more veiled, but the fact of the matter is, for these themes to be showing up so consistently, someone had to have a personal investment in them. Someone with clout, like a creator. And within Final Fantasy, Nier, and Dark Souls, we have 3 series in the same time frame that feel like they're holding a funeral for an irregularly gendered individual. This can't be a coincidence. Our kind doesn't typically get that much attention, much less reverence. And I just want to say, I'll have to check out. I'm pretty sure in the Japanese version of Chrono Trigger, Flea identifies as male, and the joke is that they're like a cross-dresser or female presenting. Whereas in the English translation, because it was the 90s and Nintendo was a bit strict about stuff like that, they just did a joke about how they have a relatively gender ambiguous appearance. So that's something that they're going to bring up later, the idea that the English translations of these games are actually more accurate than the Japanese ones. I'm just setting that out here now, so that's coming. Meaningful symbols. So faced with this burgeoning mystery, I did what many other people are doing right now. Tried the free trial of critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV. After all, the Final Fantasy XIV Nier crossover raid concludes with Cade's theme combined with the iconic Final Fantasy Bridge Crossing theme, so Final Fantasy XIV seems to likely have some relevance. But wow, did I hit on the mother lode. One of the first things I noticed in Final Fantasy XIV was that one of the major currencies were tomestones of allegory, since what I'm hunting here is essentially one giant allegory that seemed relevant, because what I'm doing here is delving into a decades-old mystery. What self-respecting adventurer would? Imagine the three of us delving into a decades-old mystery. Tell me the thought doesn't put your heart to racing. Searching for an individual whose name was struck from the annals of history. No, my lord, Ramza is. My brother's final wish before he surrendered to the Aether was that his name be struck from the annals of history. A defector who was deemed unworthy of commemoration, but whose friend created a commemoration in secret. Defectors have been deemed unworthy of commemoration. No crystal exists for the individual in question, or shouldn't exist at any rate, and wouldn't had a friend not created one in secret. Their presence was deemed vulgar and inflammatory, so it had to be recorded obliquely in ostensibly unpolitical works. Now, all theater troupes, domestic and foreign, must submit their works for approval by the Central Imperial Board of Censors. If a play is deemed vulgar or inflammatory, it is banned and the troupe denied their writs of transit. The worst offenders? Well, they are never heard from again. The principal of the Majestic, however, chose a third option, to express his disapproval for the new emperor's policies obliquely in ostensibly unpolitical works. Something that the censors failed to spot, allowing us to appreciate the true message. Mayhap you have heard of my father's latest play, the Zodiac Brave story. On the surface, it is an innocent retelling of a well-known Garlean fairy tale, hardly worthy of the censors' attention, but beneath it is something quite different, a fact the censors failed to spot when they approved the play. The play quickly became a huge success, the common folk loved its fantastical story, while the learned class appreciated its true message. Waiting for a time when the church has fallen out of favor, the truth can prevail. And what better way for the words to remain forever preserved than in one of the most highly guarded vaults in all the realm? Then, one day, when the church has fallen out of favor, the chronicle will be discovered and the truth shall prevail. And all it takes for us to find that truth is deciphering a copious use of allegory. Though their copious use of allegory defieth any single interpretation, the oracles point a most disturbing picture. One of the worlds parallel to our own, apart yet linked, reduced to ruin within every umbral calamity. I'm not doing anything here but just taking the text literally, seeking the source of Ricard's monomyth, transposing the ideas around, trying to return the masterpiece to its original glory. It's like glimpsing into the mind of the creator. Oh, and look who's standing there in the background. I feel truly privileged to be involved in the restoration of the sanctum. Returning each masterpiece to its original glory is like glimpsing into the mind of the artisan from whose hands it was wrought. Something miraculous has happened here, and to get to the bottom of it, we need to perform an exercise in translation. To properly translate something, you need to understand how the author thinks. As an astrologian quest puts it, someone closely attuned with what the Aether can, in a sense, link themselves with others, feeling their joy, feeling their pain. Scholars of the soul call this empathy. Crystal gazers and card readers call it the Wheel of Fortune. We astrologians call it collective unconsciousness. A translation is a process of inductive reasoning, where we reverse engineer the motivations behind the language of a text. Sometimes this involves the cold logic of pattern recognition. Sometimes this requires being able to feel the emotional intent behind various inclusions, to empathize with the author. There's a passage from the book Gödel, Escher, Bach about the concept of decoding systems that I find useful thinking about this sort of translation. When you confront a formal system you know nothing of, and if you hope to discover some hidden meaning in it, your problem is how to assign interpretations to its symbols in a meaningful way. You may make several tentative stabs in the dark before finding a good set of words to associate with the symbols. It is very similar to attempts to crack a code, or to decipher inscriptions in an unknown language like Linear B or Crete. The only way to proceed is by trial and error based on educated guesses. When you hit a good choice, a meaningful choice, all of a sudden things just feel right, and work speeds up enormously. Pretty soon everything falls into place. But it is uncommon, to say the least, for someone to be in the position of decoding a formal system turned up in the excavations of a ruined civilization. I think the Squaresoft of the early 90s is our ruined civilization. Something happened there. From Zeal and Chrono Trigger to Xanarkin in Final Fantasy X to Amarot in Final Fantasy XIV. The Square's games became obsessed with civilizational collapse, and of course, both Dark Souls and Nier are no stranger to those themes. Meanwhile, if we're searching for an allegorical anchor, we have an interview with the head honcho expressing the sentiment, "I hated Square, the whole business part of it." Given a loathing for the whole business part, if we're searching for an allegory, it becomes relevant that in Chrono Trigger, the thing that brought ruin to the Kingdom of Zeal was the Mammon Machine, or that the initial villain of Final Fantasy VII was the Shinra Electric Power Company, when Squaresoft's parent company at the time was Denyu Sha, a power line construction company. These things being allegorical isn't exactly a huge logical leap. Which makes it all the more interesting that at this point of time emerges a repeated theme of major feminine figures being portrayed, imprisoned, and generally treated like shit. For instance, in Final Fantasy XIV, we have Titania, the explicitly non-binary king of the fairies of Il-Meg, locked in their castle to halt the spread of the light and the end of their world. Why? Why did you imprison us? Such boredom, such tedium we have suffered. It is unfair. Unfair. Come play with us. But this is still ostensibly a Dark Souls thread, so how does the Souls series connect to this? Well, I think there's a reason FromSoft got into making games in the mid-90s concurrent with the fall of old Squaresoft. A moment when that scholar at Bergenwith brought the forbidden blood to Cainhurst Castle, you might say. I suspect there's a very specific reason why the scythe-wielding Rurifon of FromSoft's Shadow Tower Abyss has this dialogue. "I am Rurifon. I'm looking for a man. He stole my things, the cowardly fool. If you find him, you may kill him. Return my things. Well, if you can." The head fake with the first line break is glorious. Because every great one loses a child and then yearns for a surrogate, Seath may have betrayed their own, but that betrayal was a two-way street, and I suspect it all stems metaphorically into a single moment in narrative space. An orphan generation. It's likely that you're still extremely skeptical at this point, but I'm honestly just riffing off of what FromSoft president Hidetaka Miyazaki told us himself. Now, I'm president. I get to meet a lot of other company presidents. They're such weird people. I'm fascinated by them. I use some of them as enemy characters in our game. Which leads me to the absolutely tantalizing possibility that the center of all this is a transgender individual who dreamed up Dark Souls to turn herself into a revenant so she could complain about 1990 Squaresoft from beyond the grave. To be a bit more serious, if anyone remotely matching this experience actually existed, they are my hero. The person who single-handedly dragged me into video game storytelling in the first place, and then years after I had given up on it, somehow dragged me back into it again with Bloodborne. They're the only person who ever told a story I genuinely related to, and discovering that they may have actually existed compels me to attempt to tell their story. As Lucatiel puts it, "Loss frightens me to no end. Loss of memory, loss of self. Sometimes I feel obsessed with this insignificant thing called self. But even so, I am compelled to preserve it. Am I wrong to feel so? Surely you do the same in my shoes. My name is Lucatiel. I beg of you, remember my name, for I may not myself. I, more than anything in the world, want them to be remembered, so I'm going on my own quixotic journey to put the pieces of their life back together. It's just that I wish to know the truth, and no one, not even loving Elizabeth, will tell me. The Emerald Herald told us in Dark Souls 2, Bearer of the curse, seek misery, for misery will lead you to greater, stronger souls. Seek those whose names are unutterable, the four endowed with immense souls. She gave me the strength to deal with this goddamn mutant body. Do you know how long I've been like this? How much I loathe myself? Oh, it's going to be a long night. Let's share the torment, shall we? Struggle all you wish. I encourage it. Your death will be all the sweeter. Why does it fade away? Ah, I understand. It feeds on my spite, on my suffering. Well, I've sought out misery, and I think it's led me to the greatest, strongest soul of all, an unfathomably brilliant individual who shaped the course of video game history for over 3 decades entirely from the shadows, and she was one of our own. Many of you won't get why that last part is so important to me. There's a passage in the book Detransition Baby about the lack of elders in the trans community. Here's the author's summary of that section. Elephants have a culture, and it's a matriarchal culture. Elephants are also huge. They have a lot of power. They have emotions. It's the mothers who teach young elephants how to behave, how to not lash out, because if an elephant lashes out, it creates a lot of destruction with just one swing of that trunk. So elephants spend a lot of time learning from elders how to control themselves. Then poachers came along, and they killed an entire generation of mother elephants who would have taught young elephants how to control themselves. and oftentimes they did it in front of young elephants who were then traumatized. So what ended up happening was you had groups of traumatized young elephants running across game parks in various countries wreaking havoc, just having no social codes, not understanding how to control their trauma and rage. Then I thought about what it looks like to be trans, especially on the internet, but also in basic society. There are ways that we interact with each other and sometimes end up ostracizing each other, hurting each other. The metaphor felt really resonant in that the mother figures who would have been like, hey girls, chill out, we lost them to HIV. We lost them to substance abuse. We lost them to suicide. We lost them to going stealth because they couldn't be openly trans, so they just disappeared into cis-hetero world. So we ended up being an orphan generation. Actually knowing this creator existed would have meant a lot to me growing up, but even not knowing about them and not understanding myself, their stories resonated with me in a way I'm only fully piecing together decades later. There are so many fan theories out there about this or that character being trans. In Final Fantasy VII alone, we have Cloud, Aerith, and even Sephiroth. But the thing that sucks is that so many people feel the need to preface these theories with, obviously, this probably wasn't intended by the writers, but no, fuck that. The creator was one of our own, and so of course these stories are ours. That doesn't mean the characters themselves have to be canonically trans. It's genuinely a great thing if those stories resonate with cis people too, because that makes them shared stories, and maybe that shared space can help us learn to better empathize with each other. But for this to happen, it's necessary to establish that the trans readings are not merely fan theories, they were the genesis. The first step on this journey will be going back to the Age of the Ancients and deciphering how the very first of these games were made, and rebuild that history with a handful of new assumptions. 1. That there's at least one major contributor missing from the official history. 2. They were some variant of transgender. 3. They were forced out in the early 1990s. 4. Their design philosophy was carried over to both the Souls games as well as the Nier series. 5. Nearly everything is an allegory. It's a set of assumptions that has completely changed the way I look at video games in the most wonderful of ways. I am in complete and utter awe. Something actually beautiful has taken place here. The patterns are too intricate to have arisen purely by chance, and I'm confident that I'm not imagining them. For once, I'm nowhere near imaginative enough to come up with something like this on my own. I'm also frankly far too cynical. So with that being said, we need to start back at the beginning. It's the stretch of the story that I like to call The Boy and the Dragon Gay. Final Fantasy. Yeah, I guess, first off, I just want to say, I totally get where this person's coming from, but the thing is, there are actually a lot of trans, intersex, and, non-binary game creators from Japan at this time that are worth learning about. You don't have to make up a fake one like this. I'm sorry, I know someone's going to accuse me of mansplaining or whatever, but this is so fascinating. I love people. People are so good. I appreciate the condescension mask is concerned, but I assure you, I am doing about as well as one could hope in 2021. That being said, I don't mind adversarial examination, so I'll give this an honest response. Endorf posted, and also almost all of your premises are flawed, like, I've got a theory why Squaresoft, a Japanese company, became obsessed with collapse and decaying civilization after falls of empires in the early 90s. The Lost Decade refers to a period of economic stagnation in Japan caused by the asset price bubble's collapse in late 1991. First of all, it's pretty reductive to assume that every piece of media coming out of Japan between 1991 and 2021 has to be solely about the Lost Decade. If you want to do a literary analysis on how 20 years of economic stagnation influenced the creation of Dark Souls, that'd honestly be pretty cool. But you haven't. Calling something an obvious explanation because you've heard of an event and can cite the first line of a Wikipedia article is just lazy. Now, with me doing that work for you, because I was eventually headed in this direction anyways, the Lost Decade as a sole explanation doesn't fit the narratives in question. Two of the earliest examples, Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VII, have environmental disturbances as one of the major triggers of societal collapse. Given that the Lost Decade was driven by the collapse of an asset bubble, environmentalist concerns don't play into it at all. Thus, even if the Lost Decade is an influence, it cannot possibly be the only one in play. But the biggest problem is that the Lost Decade is just that, a decade. Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VII were both in development in 1994, and while I can't find the citations offhand, the scripts for both would have been in progress as early as 1992. No one at that point would have known what the long-term impacts of the asset crash would be at that time, and most people's lives would probably not have been that drastically affected until at least a few years later. But a person who would have been highly sensitive to the asset price drop would be an asset owner. A tycoon spooked at the loss of their paper wealth, and frantically looking for ways to recover. Given that, it's pretty fascinating that from Final Fantasy V onwards, we have a particular breed of minor villains show up repeatedly in the series. Final Fantasy V, King Tycoon convinces you to kill the Guardian of the Earth Crystal and complete the disruption of the crystals as a balancing force in the world, and culminates with the floating ruins of an ancient civilization crashing out of the sky. Final Fantasy VI, Owzer, the richest man in Jador, an avid art collector, and morbidly obese, a detail I didn't pick up from the sprite work as a kid. While he's not a villain in Final Fantasy VI, his actions endanger the party. More interestingly, Final Fantasy XIV iterates on this concept with Valkyrie, one of the most utterly irredeemable characters in the entire game, who is a child of privilege running an artist commune city where insufficiently productive workers are literally thrown into the ocean. Chrono Trigger, Queen Zeal uses the aforementioned Mammon machine, which culminates in yet another floating advanced civilization crashing into the Earth. Final Fantasy VII, Shinra shouldn't require more explanation at this point. Final Fantasy VIII, Norg, a wealthy Shubi who is vain, selfish, and cowardly. He funds the creation of the garden, but eventually undermines the mission of the garden by diverting all of the purposes to fill his own pockets. Also visually coded as obese. Edit, forgot one more. Final Fantasy Tactics. Algus/Argath is a shitty little noble with total contempt for peasants who he sees as beneath him. The Ivalist raid in Final Fantasy XIV expands on this character by calling him a weak and petty noble who believed that his blood entitled him to power. His raid fight involves giving the players orders they must follow in order to avoid a penalty, or if it's to the insufferable judge system in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. That said, the rigid enforcement of rules shows up in both the story for Norg in Final Fantasy VIII. Garden faculty serves as Norg's authority within the garden, enforcing rules and exerting pressure on Cid when needed, as well as the Valkyrie storyline in Final Fantasy XIV. Oh, you dim, deluded child. Have you ever paused to consider what it takes to maintain such a paradise in this barren, broken world of ours? The guarantee of safety and stability? The knowledge that if one only abides by the rules, one has naught to fear? As I mentioned, the director of the series at the time of Final Fantasy V is quoted as saying, "I hated Square, the whole business part of it." This suggests that he ran into opposition over creative control with someone who had even more power than he did, like, say, a financier. So if we take the text relatively literally, someone who was funding the company likely got spooked by the asset price collapse in 1991 and demanded more creative control over the series in order to seek immediate profitability. And the story writer made that increasingly more overt element in the narrative as the financier's power waned. It's both the most literal read of the collective narratives and the most functional at explaining what we do know about the direction of the series. And if people want to pathologize me for performing the forbidden witchcraft of textual analysis, there's nothing I can do to stop them. With that said, I'm just taking the stories at face value and seeing where that leads me. The unavoidable result is that not once but twice, Final Fantasy games have featured individuals known as the Creator with androgynous or actively shifting gender appearances. This coincides with similar themes showing up in other games at the same time, and I want to see where this leads. And yeah, I have a sudden, unexpected emotional investment in this now. I feel like I have a duty to be honest and upfront about that. It was, in no way, what I was looking for when I started, but it became unavoidable due to multiple narrative inclusions I've brought up earlier in the thread. This particular thread hits home because the unhealthy thing about me is how much of my life I've lost to letting myself be bullied out of spaces whenever I share anything I'm actually passionate about. So the extent of my investment in the Creator narrative isn't some absurdity that there's a coded message meant specifically for me. It's that if there really was someone who matches the description behind the scenes, they were less of a coward than I am, and I admire them for that. Vandar posted, "So, I almost wonder if it would be worth, looking at the credits for early Final Fantasy games and cross-referencing them with the credits of some of From's output and seeing if there's any crossover there. I have a policy of trying to not tie known individuals into this as much as I can avoid. There's also a particular textual reason why I think more than one individual might have stayed anonymous. That being said, one of the mysteries about Dark Souls 3 was how Philinor appears to be a reference to the 1985 OVA Angel's Egg, and what that means for Dark Souls. If we posit that Dark Souls has a connection to Final Fantasy, well, those two works are chronologically adjacent, and that's taken me to places I really wasn't expecting, but while there is a specific person involved with both, this isn't about them. Rather, it's about the unexpected place that the thematic overlap between their collective works takes things. I also want to thank you all for coming to my defense. It really does mean a lot to me." Endorf, I assure you, the thing I'm criticizing is not you doing textual analysis. Like that recurring bit about the random rich dudes in Final Fantasy games is a totally valid and kind of interesting read. I just object to inventing a person out of whole cloth. It's not out of whole cloth. I don't know where you jumped into this thread, and some of the confusion might be on me because organization is not my strong point, even in the best of times, but the post you're responding to exclusively is a continuation of this earlier post laying out why I believe the text of Dark Souls suggests it's a memorial to an actually existing person. If you have criticisms of the logic I used to get there, I am open to considering them. But even if you disagree with my reasoning, I'm certainly not inventing it out of whole cloth. I can only answer for my actual crimes, not my imagined ones. I suspect you're also drastically misinterpreting my motivations. I didn't start this thread over a year ago with the intent to conjure up the existence of some individual to make me feel better. I had been working on an interpretation that Dark Souls was a meta-narrative about having to throw away unworkable game designs for 1.5 years when I realized that something far more personal seemed to be going on, at which point I threw away about 120 pages of work and started over. This isn't a flight of fancy, it's actually really inconvenient for me. The older interpretation was so much safer, but I now think it was incomplete enough to be wrong. So with that said, here's some more answers for your specific criticisms. Quote, and Final Fantasy Legend isn't even a Final Fantasy game, it's a Saga game that was rebranded as Final Fantasy in the West. The most likely origin for both the Saga and Seiken series was as a way for Squaresoft to experiment with unproven game designs or more unconventional storytelling without diluting the main brand of Final Fantasy, possibly stemming from Final Fantasy II's leveling system being a bit rough. That separation would have been more of a branding strategy than any kind of creative firewall. If you go back to the cast of Final Fantasy Legend / Makai Tushi Saga, there is only 2 people who don't have a credit in the mainline series game. By a pretty informal count, maybe I missed 1 or 2. It's extremely unlikely that it's not considered part of the broader creative tradition. For example, Final Fantasy XIII gave its final boss an instant death rotor ability as a tribute to Legend Sawbug. The Four Lords questline and raid series in Final Fantasy XIV is also certainly a reference to Final Fantasy Legend, as Legend used all 4 of them as bosses. And then a quote. There's no actual connection between these 2 entities other than them both being androgynous deities in Square games, which is an incredibly common theme in Japanese media in general. End quote. What's going on with TAF's creator is not androgyny. The middle form is androgynous, but the first and last, second and fourth technically, are not androgynous. If androgyny were the only piece of symbolism I was working on, then the list of possible connections would be impossibly broad. But the prime candidates are all 1. Explicitly gender non-conforming in some fashion, 2. Show evidence of suffering from a degenerative disease, 3. Show up in the time frame of 2008 to 2011. The FFL creator doesn't fit in this criteria and isn't strictly speaking an integral part of anything, but if the Final Fantasy series specifically was willing to use meta-referential characters in 2008, it had to have started somewhere. Quote, look, if we're talking about text, what about the fact that Final Fantasy IV After Years creator and the Final Fantasy Legend creator have different names in Japanese? Final Fantasy Legends is Kami/God, and the After Years is Kurita, or literally the English word creator. You could say that Final Fantasy Legend staff told them to translate God as creator, but then why not write the name as creator to begin with if they were trying to make some sort of veiled statement? And if they were trying to make a veiled statement, why wouldn't they keep the Japanese name of the Final Fantasy IV the After Years boss the same as the Final Fantasy Legend boss? Is this secret information something only English speakers are allowed to piece together? Isn't it more likely that the name creator in Final Fantasy Legend was just born of an attempt to get around Nintendo's religious censorship policies at the time, and the use of creator in the after years was entirely unrelated? Just to get this out of the way, I don't think they were trying to make a veiled statement. I have no guarantee that any of this was ever intended to be communicated to the audience, and I often feel like I'm trespassing. It's also certainly the case that any motivation is not uniform amongst all the theoretical participants. As for the word choice, it didn't occur to me to even bring this up, as strict linguistic carryover is so rare in Soulsborne that it struck me as unremarkable. That said, you're correct that Nintendo almost certainly would have not allowed God as a translation, but there are possible reasons that creator might have been the preferred interpretation, or became the preferred interpretation over time. Due to the constraints of the Game Boy cartridge space, the original Japanese script might have been done in an extremely minimalist format and therefore preferred the condensed storage space of Kami. Once the game as a whole was done, the translator would have known precisely how much space they would have had to expand into English without going outside of the cartridge space, and this might have allowed them a degree of interpretive freedom that the initial script did not have. I'm sorry to interrupt, but as somebody with only a surface level familiarity with translating games from Japanese to English, the idea that the English translation had more space and was able to add is so contrary to everything I've ever read about translating games from this era. I totally recommend Clyde Mandelin's Legends of Localizations blog. It's very well written and very accessible, and one of the recurring things is that because of the difference between the Japanese character sets and the English character sets, the English translation usually had to condense a lot. So I just wanted to point that out here. I just wanted to point out that one specific nitpick. 2. This is admittedly purely speculative, but I do wonder if the attitude towards katakana loanwords changed over the 2 decades that separated the two games. Are 2008 audiences more broadly familiar with English than a 1988 audience? Did loanwords in fantasy writing gradually become a sort of exoticism as the medium developed? This is just idle curiosity on my part, so you don't have to treat it as a serious answer. Given the emerging Gnostic influences within the tradition, creator might have become favored over time for its connotations. Within the dualism of Gnosticism, there is a distinction between supreme, transcendent God and a blind, evil demiurge responsible for creating the material universe, thereby trapping the divine spark within matter. The use of God in these branches of media often applies to warrior gods like Gwyn, who are not creators, but rather conquerors of the universe, and in Gwyn's case, a maintainer of the flame. Hypothetically, this dualism might be behind the red and blue moons of Final Fantasy IV, with Zebus serving as the demiurge from the red moon. In this context, creator would be the preferred word to contrast with this death-drive deity, Zamus/Zeramus. But as for the simplest explanation, for my estimation, suppose you're making a game to honor someone's memory and they're dying from cancer. You're reworking one of the characters as part of the tribute, but that character has more than one identifier. The most obvious thing is to go to them and ask them which one they prefer. Sometimes the message contained in these games aren't intended for the player. But in any case, while none of this is ultimately that important, it's still kind of fun because language just might be the centerpiece of this entire puzzle. And that's the last post that Sibyl Disobedience has made in over a month. This was August 18th. I'm recording this on September 20th. Sibyl, if you're out there, I want you to know I made my jokes and my cracks and stuff, but please don't stop writing. This is so good and interesting, and it'd be really a shame if you kept your light under a bushel because some people on the internet disagreed with you in a way that wasn't exactly polite or nice. This is so entertaining to think about, and just a cool example of a human brain working. I'm so glad that this exists as a piece of outsider art, and I'm really glad it exists. As a closing remark, I mentioned Room 237 at the beginning, the documentary about very interesting out there theories about The Shining. There's a fiction movie called Beneath the Silver Lake that was created by the guy who did It Follows. It's also about, human pattern recognition and piecing together clues that seem to reach that. It kind of is like if it's like if this person was the protagonist in a noir. It's a great movie. I would totally recommend you watch it. If seeing somebody, just grab all these disparate things and put together, this sort of map is interesting to you. Great movie. Totally worth your time. And as always, thank you for listening. Again, apologies if I overstep my bounds here. I'm not doing this to mock or belittle this person. Obviously, none of this stuff is true or real, but what an interesting thing to read. And the world's a better place for having it. So, and also, if I have any new listeners, it's because this is the only Dark Souls thing I've ever done. Check out some other videos. This is a little outside of my my wheelhouse, but I make a lot of fun stuff. I think you'll enjoy it. As always, thank you for listening. Oh boy.